Amen. So, did anybody have any outstanding questions that didn't get addressed?
Do you remember what you said about, there was a question about the priests and Levites in the Midnight history, and you said, you said there isn't really a model for that in the Midnight history, but I remember when that was being opened up, we were showing, you know, like the people leaving the churches, we saw that as the Levites, or we used that as a witness to show at the midnight cry. That's when the Levites come in.
So it may be that those people who are coming in, the Levites...
Can you repeat the question?
She's asking about the priests and the Levites in the Millerite history. What does it look like? And at the midnight cry, those people who are coming in, are they priests or are they Levites? So my honest answer is I'm not 100% sure. And part of the reason why I'm not sure is when you apply the parable of the 10 virgins over that model, how that actually works. Because in the parable of the 10 virgins, when all the people join the procession, they all get to the house of the bridegroom, the door is shut, and that's all good and well. But when you go to Millerite history, and at the midnight cry, the cry is made, and then people join the movement, do you understand that to mean that they're joining the procession?
That's what I thought we were saying.
So if they're joining the procession, then who are the 49,000 plus that leave who have left the procession? It doesn't fit in with the Millerite history, with the parable of the 10 virgins.
But we say Ezra 7:9 is encoded in the Millerite history, so wouldn't we see those two groups if Ezra 7:9 is like encoded into that history as well?
Again, I'm not even sure really how we tackle Ezra 7, Ezra 8, when it comes to the priests and Levites. I haven't got good clarity on, because when you see those groups, all three of them are together, they're all leaving their journey on the same day. In fact, some of that work is contingent upon Levites, even Nethinims doing a work, which all seems sort of out of sequence.
But wouldn't you just see the priests and Levites because it's the parable of Adventism, so it's dealing with just two groups?
Yeah, only because you took us to Ezra 7 and 8. When you do that, you know the Nethinims are there and they're doing a work at the very beginning, which seems counterintuitive to what we understand. So I don't know how to go into the Millerite history and unpackage that. The other thing that I would also suggest is that when you go to the Millerite history, when all these people are joining and you assented to the fact that they're joining the procession, you're inferring that the bridegroom has come and the procession is already on its way. Now these people are joining them. Is that what you just assented to? I thought you did, because you just said they joined the procession. And the reason I asked that is because I don't think there's any procession in the Millerite history, because they're trimming their lamps all the way to October, because he hasn't even got to the house yet by the time you hit up. They're planning that on October he gets there, if that makes sense. So the procession wouldn't even have begun. So all those 49,000 people that are there, whoever they are, they're not joining the procession because the procession hasn't even started. And I don't think you see that at least I don't see how you do that in the parable of the 10 virgins. You don't see all these people suddenly joining, doing something.
How can they be a part of the procession, the foolish virgins, if they've gone to the wicked city to get false oil?
I guess all I'm saying is, in the Millerite history, their own testimony, and I think Daisy would already know that, their own testimonies, they're still trimming their lamps all the way to October. The procession hasn't begun.
Okay.
because he hasn't arrived to her house.
Yeah.
I would argue that her house, the bride's house, is the earth, and he's on his journey there. And here at August or July, they've got a telescope and they can see him coming, literally. And the telescope is the word of God. They know by faith that he's already on his way. If that makes sense, if you can pick that analogy up. They've got the Bible to show them, if they had a telescope, they could actually see Jesus coming. He's already left his home. And whenever he left his home, they don't know. But in April, they have no visibility of him. So they don't know if he's left or not. He's supposed to already have been there. But by the time you get to the summer of 44, using a simple analogy, you can point the telescope up to Orion, you can see him coming. And he's not going to get to Earth until October, which is when the procession would begin. So, to me, the parable is not that straightforward. That's why I'm not sure how you do priests and Levites in that modelling. Any other questions on what we looked at before?
It's a question about what the logic you just used. Are you saying you don't know how to solve the parable of the 10 virgins in relation to Millerite history, or are you saying that sometimes the parables aren't going to speak to every aspect of that history? Are you saying it's something that we haven't figured out yet, or that it's because parables only convey a certain percentage of the information that need to be recognized? What are you saying?
I'm admitting my lack of understanding, primarily. That was the main point I want to make. I know that, tell me if I'm understanding what you just said, parables have their limitation.
Yeah.
So I understand that, and I wasn't answering to that point. I know parables have the limitation and we have to be careful how we handle them. Don't ask too much of that, those few sentences to do too much work for you, because they're not designed to do that. I understand that, but if we were to take a parable, I think we should let the parable run its course and do its work. And it seems to me that the Millerites weren't doing that. If they're going to get to October 22nd and they've had a shut door, what that would tell you is that they were already on a procession, which means that the bridegroom had already had arrived sometime before. The problem that we face, that I face, that I've struggled with, is when you read Matthew 25, it's only a few verses. Then you've got the history of the Millerites and how they're going to approach that. And then you've got a third narrative on all of that, which is Ellen White. And when she does it, she's going to do it in two different ways. She's going to comment on the Millerite history in relationship to Matthew 25, but she's also going to take Matthew 25 as a kind of just a concept or a parable and apply that in different ways. So you've got all of this information to gather together. My understanding of the Millerite testimony of themselves is that from the summer of 44, they begin to trim their lamps. And that trimming of the lamp continues way past August, way past September. And I haven't seen explicit that they've done it, but I'm saying they're trimming their lamps all the way to October 22nd. Because they expect October 22nd for him to have arrived. And I'm basing that upon the idea that the bride's house is earth and his house is in heaven, and they're taking that in a literal fashion, that he's going to come back down to earth to pick us up and take us back. So the procession going back is people literally going back to heaven. And October the 13th, I know people haven't mentioned this a lot, but it's not obscure to us. I think at least a number of us. But October the 13th is a key waymark in Millerite history. Because on October the 13th, it's the first day of the 7th month. the Millerites have a recognition of that, and William Miller has a testimony that he says either in 10 days' time or 15, he's not sure, Christ is about to return. Because he's not sure about Christ's return being on the Day of Atonement or the Feast of Tabernacles 5 days later. So he's still not fully clued up on that. But he knows by October 13th, that they've got limited time. And what they do is they bend all the rules. This is not actually connected to what you're asking. October 22nd, they say the second Advent. And he knows that before the second Advent, you're going to have a close of probation. So he marks October the 13th as the close of probation, 10 days before the second Advent. Whereas we would argue that the 13th of October is the Feast of Trumpets, and I would argue that the Feast of Trumpets is the loud cry that the Day of Atonement's about to hit, which is interesting because of what's happened in our year as well, October the 13th. So I don't think that's a coincidence. But that's just a warning of something about to happen. So just coming back to that, I've understood that the Millerites are saying that they're trimming their lamps right to the very end, waiting for him to come. Which to me would then say that the procession back home is the literal second Advent, when he comes and takes us and we go back to heaven. And I'd argue that from Alan White's comment in Early Writings 55.1, where we said that the tarrying time is October 22nd, 1844. It's not even on here anyway. October 22nd, 1844, that's when they begin to tarry, because they're still waiting for him to come. And at some time in the future, there's going to be a cry that he's coming. We'd prepare for that, and then he would come and take us home. So, when we talk about the people joining the procession, in the Millerite history, and Daisy was saying perhaps that's the Levites that are joining them, I'm saying those 49,000 people that are joining, I'm not sure that they're actually joining the procession. I'm not sure how to factor that into the story. But if we were to do that, then it would be a different application to what the Millerites were even doing. So if we're going to mark the procession from the summer of 44, before I carry on with that, so the problem with the Millerites is they've got this shut door story, which is taken from Matthew 25, and they've also got this idea that the procession hasn't really begun because they've been trimming their lamps all of this time. So they've taken a parable and conflated two different events and made them the same. That he's arrived at her house October 22nd, when the procession would begin, but at another level they're saying by October 22nd you've got a shut door, which means the procession's already followed through. So they're taking it at different levels. Although I've never seen them actually run that parable all the way through in a consistent fashion. So to me, it's not that parables have their limitations, it's that they're being applied in different ways, which is why I was asking Sister Daisy, that where would you mark him actually coming to her house? I think you'd have to mark him coming to her house in the summer of 44 for them to have a procession for that 3-month period, and all these people are joining the procession. And if you're going to do that, then I think you have to switch that round, and you might then argue that you've got two groups, because I would argue that the Millerites who are already there would be a symbol of the bride, and the people that are joining would then become a symbol of the virgins that are the 5 virgins that are coming. But however way you work that out, I don't know how you get to the end of the parable and say most of those people are going to be lost. It doesn't seem to fit to the parable. I understand parables have their limitation, but I think the Millerites, in their self-analysis, are breaking some of those rules. Because I think the rules have to be, and we saw that with parable teaching. Alan White comments on that. It's a Spirit Prophecy quote that I was paraphrasing, that the rules of nature have to follow the rules of the spiritual, rules of the natural. They have to follow the same tenets. And the Millerites don't do that. They kind of jump and break and sort of get a model to work to suit them. And we've just kind of followed suit on that. That's why I'm not too confident on taking the parable and actually getting it to run properly through the Millerite line. I don't know if it's that easy to do. So that was a long comment, and I don't think I probably even said much. I apologise.
You said in the previous study that when the Brethren studied the PBM, they took some characteristics, okay, and after they reached a wrong conclusion. But when we study also, we are doing quite the same things. And we add.
Who's we? When you say when we study,
okay,
you're doing
so when
quite
I'm
the same
studying,
thing.
I'm doing not you, because you are an expert on parable, or Jeff also. But
No, I didn't mean that. I just asking who the
okay,
they and who
okay.
the we were, because they and we are the same
I'm not talking
people.
about Jeff and you, okay? So.
You do the same thing. If you're talking, are you talking about yourself or someone else? Well, I'm not sure. The movement.
I think I'm talking about. I'm talking in general.
Okay, so let's talk in general terms then. In general, who are the they and who are the us? We're all the same people.
Yes, I said when we study,
Yeah.
we take in some characteristics and after we try to apply them, okay? And when I hear you, it seems that when you do that, we can or we reach one conclusion.
Okay.
Okay, so my question is, so is our methodology or our understanding of the methodology or how to apply this characteristic is wrong, or how to avoid, to prevent, to commit, to reach some wrong conclusion?
So I was speaking to Sister Natalie about this during the break, and the problem with that, I don't find it easy for me to answer a question like that. This open-ended question is, how do we stop making mistakes? I don't know how to answer that question. Like, I'm going to say, follow the rules, and you're going to say, what rules? I'm going to say, William Miller's rules, and you're going to say, we're all following William Miller's rules, and I'm saying we're not because we're making mistakes. But to see where a person is misapplying the rules, I don't think is that easy. I'm not trying to make that comment to disparage people or what,
discourage?
Yes.
attack.
Attack? Okay.
It's criticise. It's not to attack or criticise people. It's an acknowledgement of how easy it is to make mistakes. It was only to identify that point and to show or to encourage people, not that Elder Jeff or myself are experts on parable teaching. It's not to do that. It's to show the worthiness of this approach, to try to be careful, to try and follow the rules. These are not the only rules, but they're just some examples of some rules. And too often we get tempted to skip steps and to sort of step out a little bit further than we perhaps should, and then it sort of feels comfortable, and we take another step, and before we realise we're kind of out into a territory or a zone that maybe we've entered into a place that's wrong.
Yes, but to detect that, it's because we think
Yes.
that we apply.
So the question is, how do you detect that? And I'm saying, I don't know if I can sort of say, if you just did this, you're always going to be safe. I think more often than not, we're not critical with one another. We do private studies. Often, I think it's a lot of bad teaching, that people don't explain things clearly, so you can't even observe where they've made the mistake. So I don't think it's a singular problem. As an example, there are some people who do a study, and because they're embarrassed or they're ashamed, they won't present their material in front of people of experience. They say, no, it's too embarrassing or whatever. So when you do that, you're headed for trouble, aren't you? because you've got no one able to check what you're doing. So it's things like that where people become too shy to present or to even ask questions. So I think sometimes it's a combination of bad teaching, sometimes it's a combination of people aren't willing to open themselves up to examination. But with respect to the methodology, I think we have to be careful. Let me give you an example of this. So if you've got your devices, go to this quote. So this is a quote, maybe you're not familiar with it, and how would we approach this quote? That's the question. This is 15 MR, page 228, paragraph 2. 228, paragraph 2. Let me just pull it up on my computer because I've only got it. (228), paragraph 2. So the title of this section is manuscript 1166, and it's called The General Conference Relocation, the Book of Daniel, Elder Haskell's Work and Wages. So it's just a mishmash of some comments or articles or statements that Ellen White's making. It's all been put together in this manuscript called 1166. And it's if you go back to 227 paragraph 1, which is the beginning of this section, it says it's written July 30th, 1903. So let me just read this. Then it says, the people of God need to study what characters they must form in order to pass through the test and proving of the last days. Many are living in spiritual weakness and backsliding. They know not what they believe. Let us read and study the 12th chapter of Daniel. It is a warning that we shall all need to understand before the time of the end. There are ministers claiming to believe the truth who are not sanctified through the truth. Unless a change comes in their lives, they will say, my Lord delayeth his coming. Read the 21st chapter of Luke. In it, Christ gives the warning, take heed yourselves lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness, cares of this life, so that they come upon you unawares. So she quotes Luke 21, 34 to 36. The signs of the times are fulfilling in our world, and yet the churches generally are represented as slumbering. Shall we not take warning from the experience of the foolish virgins, who, when the call came, behold, the bridegroom cometh, go you out to meet him, found that they had no oil in their lamps, and while they went out to buy oil, the bridegroom went. So she's going to quote Matthew 25. What I haven't done, I've obviously gone back to the beginning of the passage and read it through all the context, etc. So we sort of just went into this. So, Sister Shemaine, so you read 228 paragraph 2. What would you do with that? How would you approach that? Why have I gone there for? What's an interesting statement there, or phrase?
Because, let us read. We have to read before the time of the end and yet.
Time of the end.
Yeah.
So it says the time of the end, and you just said it said before. So here you are, we'll do a line and we've got time of the end, and where are you?
I'm before.
You're here. And this is 1903. Okay, so I've just diagrammed what we've said. So you tell me what she's talking about.
Okay, she said okay, she's talking about the last days, the characters that the good people should have before the great test.
That's not what I'm asking you. I'm not asking you to just paraphrase what's written. I'm asking you, what are you going to do with this information? What is it teaching you?
So that means, for me, that means that in the time period of the time of the end.
In the time period of the time of the end, when does the time period of the time of the end begin?
For 1989. No, not in this time period.
No, I'm asking you. She just says before the time of the end, and she's writing this in 1903. So the time of the end is ahead of you. So what is that? How are you reading that passage? So you're asking me the question, how do we avoid making mistakes? And I'm saying it first begins by getting a quote and approaching the quote, how you read that quote. So I'm asking you, how do you read what that passage is saying?
So I will say she will. I don't know if she will. If I have to put our time of the end in this.
So is that what you would do?
I don't know if it's right to do that, but I would say. So I have to know what's going on in 1903, and after I will say, okay, maybe I will put our time of the end, but I don't think that it's for their generation, 1989.
So what is she talking about then?
So she's talking about the last day.
Yeah, but she uses the phrase time of the end. What is that talking about? Sorry?
Time period just before Jesus coming. A period of time, the last days.
So this is the second advent here. Is that it? Second
Yeah.
advent?
Yeah.
And the time of the end is before the second advent.
Yeah.
Do you think that's what she's talking about? I'm not saying you're wrong. All I'm asking you is, because you ask how do you avoid making mistakes, and I'm saying it's not that easy for me to give you 3 rules and say if you follow the 3 rules you'll never make a mistake. It comes down to a reading, an approach of inspiration, how you approach these words. Because it's in the approach of the word, or the approach of history, or the approach of those waymarks, is where we begin to falter. And that's when, it's not the logic often that's the problem. It's the faulty premise.
No.
Because more often than not the logic is correct.
What is a faulty premise?
What is a faulty means mistaken, a premise means
The premise. Okay.
the original idea, the assumptions that we're making.
Okay.
Mr. Pascal? Yeah.
When you draw this diagram,
Mm-hmm.
for me, after, comment expliquer ça? Yesterday you spoke about the article of Samuel Snow in 1856, and they could guess that the second advent would be in
63.
Yes. So it is in 1903. It is past. So when I see this diagram, for me the time of the end is our time of the end, but I'm not sure. So 1989.
Okay, so the reason I brought this passage up is because someone gave it to me, and I hadn't seen this passage before. And so the question is this the gem quote that we've been looking for ages, to find the time of the end quote that there's another time at the end after 1798. Is this the quote that's going to do that for us? Because there aren't that many quotes that have time at the end in it, and it's the only one that I've ever seen that says you're in Millerite history or Advent history, and she's predicting a time at the end in the future. And it's so tempting, I think, for people like us to say, now we've got a proof text that we can go to. It's not going to give us 1989 in this quote, but now we've got the leverage to say, see, there is another time at the end, at the beginning. So the question is, how do we read what she's written? What does she mean? We have to try and go into her mind and try to understand what is she talking about. So my question is, how would you approach that? What are you saying, Sister Emma?
I wanted to do what you just said, but
Which is what?
Make it 1989, but I'm not sure in the context you can do that. I would probably lean towards what Sister Shaben said, which is that she's pointing to the last days at the end of time, the end of the world.
So she's saying time at the end in some kind of generic sense. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know, I did think it was very interesting that she's putting it in the future, and I wanted to say, yes, this is good proof that we can do that.
I'm not saying you're wrong, I'm just saying how you approach that. Because it's really tempting to do that. It'd be nice if it was true. I'm not trying to say that it isn't. The question is, Simaine's asking, how do we not make mistakes? And I'm saying it's by reading first, because everything's based upon what we read. Brother Ray.
I really want to read it in the way that we would naturally read it on this movement. However, when I look at this, I have to consider what she's dealing with in regards to Daniel chapter 12. So it seems as though she is conflating two concepts, the concept of, or the wording even, the idea of this time of the end and the idea of what's brought to view in Daniel chapter 12, and that would be Michael's coming, the prince, at the close of probation. So I think what she's doing is she's saying that you need to be ready for the close of probation in 1903.
So what Brother Ryan is saying, if I understood him correctly, he's saying that time of the end equals the end of time.
Yeah.
And he's put an extra word in here, which is probationary time.
And I'm doing that also because of this. She mentions two words, test and proving. And I think that's also brought to view in Jacob's time of trouble, that proving time.
So either this time at the end is the way we use it, if you're going to proof text, then time at the end is the beginning of testing, or she's saying the time at the end is the end of probationary time. And the end of probationary time is where you kick off Daniel 12:1. That's what Daniel 12:1 starts with, which is the end of probationary time. So how we approach her statement, which is a phrase that we use more often than not, shapes how we're going to approach this passage. And so either we'd go and say, now we've got a proof text to say we can show that there's two time at the end, plug in Daniel 11:40 verse, and now we've got a really solid answer or response for people. Or we're saying it just means the end of probationary time, it's Daniel 12:1 that she's marking, and therefore we've made no progress. We're sort of back to square one. We've always been in. It's not an important passage in the context of our movement. It's just another one. Brother Tom, then Sister Shamila.
I was just gonna say that maybe she's not referring to Daniel 12:1.
Maybe she's not.
Because she quotes Daniel 12 and she talks about the time of the end, but the time of the end is brought to view in Daniel 12 in verse 4 and verse 9 and 10 as well, and that's before Daniel 12:1. Because she talks about because it talks about the increase of knowledge that comes at that time. So I'm not disagreeing with what Brother Ryan said, but I'm saying that you could also see that it's talking about a time where knowledge is increased.
Okay, so you're basically, all the argument you're developing, if I can just condense it, is to say she's talking about 1989.
You could apply it to 1989, but I don't
What would
think
you apply it to?
the way we understand it now, yeah, 1989.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think I'm just saying she might not necessarily be referring to Daniel 12:1.
No,
Yeah.
because you've gone to other passage that says the time of the end
Yeah,
of the chapter.
because in the chapter the passage says the time
Yeah,
of the end.
so you're
is
saying
the place where
the
you
time
have
of
to
the
be.
end is going to happen in the future. And though she doesn't give you the date, you're saying you can show it's 1989.
I suppose.
What am I missing from what you're saying, or have I twisted what you said?
So we can make the inference that it's 1989.
Now, I'm not asking what the inference is. I'm asking you, what did she intend? Not what you infer.
Yeah. I think
Okay, yeah, what you infer she intended, but I'm asking you, you're saying she intended us to mean 1989, and Brother Ray is saying, no, she intended us to mean this is Daniel 12:1. Michael's standing up.
Yeah, because in Daniel 12, when it mentions the time at the end in two places, one talks about the increase of knowledge, and that happens before Daniel 12:1, and it also talks about many shall be purified and made white and tried, and that's also before Daniel 12:1. So that's all I'm saying is that I'm not reading.
I understand you've got
Okay.
logic for that. I get the logic. I'm asking you, what do you think she means?
I think she.
Because to me, that's what's important. What did she mean? Not what you want to draw out from her words or make an application of. Now, obviously, you don't know what she meant, so it's your opinion of what she meant, but I want to know what you think her opinion was, or her intent. And you're saying her intent was, she's marking 1989. You're not going to come up and say, well, she could mean this, and she could mean that. Who knows what she could mean? Because if you're going to take that position, I'm saying, well, why am I even going to listen to you? Because you're not taking inspiration and doing anything with it. You're just making your own thoughts and ideas up.
I think it's for me the difficulty is she's talking to is it Butler and Prescott? Daniels and Prescott? So I think to say what she means, she's saying it in relation to the people she's talking to rather than a group of people, rather than Adventists in their whole time, if that makes sense. She's speaking to
Of course.
in relation to two people. So I think maybe she's not even saying. Maybe she's not even talking about 1989.
What was she talking about then?
I think she's just basically the way I think she's just telling people that they need to study. If that makes
And the
sense.
time of the end has got nothing to do with that. Sister Kathy, did you say something? I heard a sister's voice.
Sorry, I'm just asking. So what's the warning then that she's saying you have to understand? Would that help?
The warning is that we need to understand the time of the end, because there are people who teach the truth, claim to teach the truth, but they're saying there's going to be a delay. Is that what you mean?
No, she's saying Daniel 12 is a warning.
Oh, okay,
that
yeah.
We have to understand. So what's the warning? Because 12:1's not really just telling you this is what's going to happen. So Michael stands up. So where's the warning in 12, chapter 12?
You tell me.
I'm asking
I don't know.
because I don't know what the warning would
Because
be.
the answer, the warning is that my Lord delayed his coming, but that's not Daniel 12. He quotes from another passage. Elder Jeff?
Well, we've dealt with this for many years, this particular passage. I won't get into all the wrangling that's went over this passage, but that one sentence there is a warning that we shall all need to understand before the time to end. If you're going to mark that time to end as 1989, then this is a warning that you have to understand before 1989. So how is that, who is it that goes through the proving and testing of the last days. It's this generation. And how do they understand that warning before 1989 if there's that generation that's living today? So I'm saying you can't be marking that as 1989. Can you?
Anton?
I don't know how to answer that question. Because you're talking to Daniels and Daniels and Prescott in 1903, telling them that they need to understand, and that was before 1989. So, at some level, there must be something you can understand before even 1989.
If you're assuming that this is talking about 1989,
Yeah.
and Jeff's argument is that it can't be by definition. And you're saying it must be able to because it's before 1989. So you just set up a premise that it's 1989, therefore you must be able to. And Jeff said it's not you can't understand before 1989, therefore it can't be 1989.
Is that what I said?
I thought that's what you said. You can't. This generation can't understand it before 1989.
Yeah.
Therefore, it can't be 1989.
Yeah. Okay.
And you're saying it's before 1989. 1989 is the time of the end. Therefore, you can understand before. You can understand something before 1989.
In her day and age.
That's
perhaps.
That's what Brother Tom is saying.
Yeah.
So, Sister Jermaine, this is an example of how straightforward is this? You read a statement, and do we read stuff into this, or do we, carefully work our way through? And I think more often than not, we're careless in our approach to it, or we can be if we're not careful. Sister Kathy.
Sometimes she would write, and she would have to reread what she wrote, not even understanding what she had written, because it was probably the Holy Spirit. But this is in connection with Daniel 12. Daniel 12. How can it be 1989?
Well, we use Daniel 12 to mark 1989 as the time of the end. And at the time of the end shall
But the perfect fulfillment of Daniel 12 will be when Michael stands up for real.
I'm not sure if you could say it that way when you say the perfect fulfillment. Perfect in the sense the complete fulfillment,
Yeah.
for sure, the complete fulfillment. But the problem with the chapter is it's structured in a funny way. The end is at the beginning, so it says this is the conclusion of the matter, Daniel 12:1, and then it tells you how you got there. It's kind of like a repeat and enlarge, because it says, and at that time, and if you trace back at that time, it takes you back to verse 40, and then it's going to do a repeat and enlarge in the following verses to show you how you get from 40 to Daniel 11 verse 40 to Daniel 12:1, but it's going to give you a different perspective of that same history, the increase of knowledge, etc., and many to run to and from all of that. It's a repeat and enlarge. That's how I understand it. So yes, it's the perfect fulfillment, the complete fulfillment of 12 is Michael standing up, for sure. And in fact, a little bit further than that, because then you're going to have Jacob's time of trouble, which essentially is taking you to the second advent. But it also lays out the history of how that's happening. So yes, it is that, Brother Daniel.
What I think she's saying is the people of God need to study what character they must form to pass the test of the last days. To pass the test of the last days, we need to study Daniel 12 to understand before the time of the ending, which means the time of the ending we mark like judgment of investigation began. Yes. So if judgment of investigation began of time of the end, we need to understand how to put our characters when that's starting.
Before. But the logic that I object is, how can you start something before when this is the beginning of your journey? Moses is born here, Christ is born here, John is born here. We're a bunch of bones here. It's only here we're going to be formed by a prophecy. This is the role of the first angel. The first angel is the one that warned you to even do anything. Because it says, begin to be ploughed, begin to be prepared. How can you prepare for something beforehand? Because the field is full of tares. The work, everything begins at the time of the end. It's not beforehand. Jeff?
I would even argue that Daniel chapter 12, which is just part of the last vision, 10, 11, and 12, but Daniel chapter 12, if you're going to treat it as a singular chapter, it begins with Michael standing up, but the last verse, Daniel is standing in his lot at the end of the days, which is, it can be understood as judgment, or it can be understood as the resurrection of the righteous at the second coming. My point is that the beginning of the chapter and the end of the chapter is pointing more to the close of probation than anything else, and that's what the emphasis of her quote is before you get to the time of the end, which can be understood as the end of probationary time, you need to have a character that'll stand during that testing time.
Sorry, Sister Chimel?
I think with the words last days there, it says test and proving of the last days. It must be a period and not a point in time. And if it's a period, then there's been some people saying, going to Daniel chapter 12, which is what it says here, the 12th chapter of Daniel, and the 12th chapter of Daniel is entitled The Time of the End, but it's not the waymark, the time of the end. It's my understanding of the time of the end here is not 1989, is that correct? When it says time of the end in Daniel 12, that's not the waymark, whether it's Millerite history 1798 or this history 1989, is that correct? When it says the time of the end in Daniel chapter 12.
What is it?
Sorry?
Tell us what it is then, or what you think it is.
I'm unclear as to, I don't think it's the waymark 1989 when it says the time of the end, when it says in...
Verse 9 and 10.
Sorry?
Verse 9 and 10.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And he said, go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. I don't think that that's a point in time. I think it's a period that has to have happened at a certain point, but I'm not distinguishing when that point is. I'm just placing it out there. It's just a sort of suggestion I'm throwing out there that the last days is a period, it's not a point specifically.
But it starts at a point.
Yes, it does. But I'm actually asking the question, when is that point? Is it the waymark point of 1989, which is typified in our history as 1989 is the beginning of the beginning, which is at the end, the time of the end of this history, or is it Millerite history? Which basically they're both the time of the end, whether you're looking at Millerite history or this history. So that was just a thought. That it's a period, not a point. And I was zooming in on the words, the last days. I don't necessarily have an answer.
Okay. Sister Ruth?
I'm also seeing it as close of probation, and I found it interesting. I don't know if it links with it, but the year 1903 was the year of pantheism, so I'm kind of seeing this quote as Ellen White trying to gather the flock, that we need to be establishing our truths, because Daniel 12 it has the time of the end literally, but also the close of probation, so it has the whole line.
Stacey?
So I was going to ask a question about verse 13. The Elder Jeff mentioned that it's speaking about like the end of this earth's history, but then verse 13 is basically speaking about Daniel standing his lot at the end of days. So if that end of days is end of time, what job exactly is Daniel doing? If he's told wait, rest, and at the end of days you will stand on duty. But if we're marking that as the end of time, what's his job?
That verse, you can find evidence can be applied more than one way. Lot can be grave, so it can be in the resurrection. It can be understood as casting lots, the judgment. He's going to be finding the judgment, or it can be understood as the book of Daniel fulfilling a purpose in the end of the days. So it depends on what context you're going to put it in. But the way we're discussing it, that Michael stands up at the beginning of the chapter, and he's coming up in his grave at the second resurrection of the righteous, in theory. That's, to me, emphasizing close of probation, and the warning in Daniel 12 is the warning about an increase of knowledge, saying that the wise need to understand that increase of knowledge, because that knowledge is what is going to perfect the character that we need to have to go through the proving of the last days.
What I'm seeing too is this is definitely talking about the very end opportunity that we will have, because it's talking about the Laodicean condition, talking about the ministers and where they're at in their walk, and what we have to do right before it all closes up. Right?
So, in summary, I wasn't trying to, to wrestle through this and come to a definitive answer. If we could, it would have been nice. But just to show us that when you read a passage, it's easy to read a statement like the time of the end, and just I don't want to say one group was right, one group was wrong, but to assume that it means something that we already have pre-existing understanding of. So this would be the time of the end, Daniel 11 verse 40, 1798. But it couldn't be 1798 because we're before that, so it therefore would be 1989. Therefore, this becomes a proof text that what we're teaching about 1989 is true. We could approach that way. It'd be very simple to do that. But as you start discussing it, you begin to see that actually it's not the only way to approach this verse. In fact, if you try to approach it that way, you can get into problems. It's not that straightforward to do that. And then the other problem that you'd face, I'm suggesting, is the weight of evidence, I think, is that Ellen White doesn't talk about 1989 or 9/11. The very point is that we were created as a movement to stand up and proclaim these events here, and that Ellen White, she can give us all the clues, and it's all hidden in the scriptures, but she doesn't give it to us in this blatant mannerism. But it's easy to do that. And connected to that problem is that many of us are not willing to mentally engage. And what I mean by that is, I know people are new in the movement, and that can always, and I don't mean to say this in a disparaging way, in a disrespectful way, it can always use as an excuse that I'm new to the movement and I don't know. But far too many of us are not actually approaching this whole message in a professional manner. And what I mean by that is, if you wanted to go for a job, you know that you need to be trained to do that work, whether it's college or university or some kind of training. And many of us are not approaching Bible study in this professional mannerism. So we come to a conference, and that conference could be two people studying together on a Sabbath. We come to these meetings unprepared. And what I mean by unprepared is we don't even know you know, the rules of engagement. It's like working in a hospital and you're in an emergency room and they just sort of drag you from another department and they say, work on this person, and you say, I have no idea what the rules are, or the rules of engagement. And the doctor says to you, well, you should know. What's your excuse for not knowing? You're a nurse, aren't you? And I think many of us are in this kind of position, and this is one of the reasons why people end up being allowed to make mistakes, because there's no checks or reins placed upon them, because many of us don't even know how to engage with the people. We don't feel confident. Not that we should know everything. I'm not saying that we should be experts, but we should be able to think. And that thought process, I think we're not familiar or comfortable with. We don't know how to ask the right questions. And part of that is because we are not in the habit of being challenged or challenging one another or engaging. So I'm sure most of you feel, I'll give an example yesterday. Elder Jeff said, any more questions on all of this? And most people, I'm assuming, are in this position. We don't know what you're talking about, so we don't even know what question to ask. So you don't even know what the question to ask, so you just remain silent. And what you end up doing, and the reason why I'm saying I know you're doing this, because all human beings are the same, and no temptation has reached you that isn't common to all of us, is you're going to say, I'm going to go home, look at the video, and work it out for myself. Most of you are going to be thinking that way, and it never works. It doesn't. So what you ended up doing is you let, if I could say it this way, I don't mean to be stand disrespectful, you let him get away with what he's teaching, because you're not fit to engage with him, because you don't even understand the framework of what he's talking about. Now, I'm not saying that to tell anyone off. I'm saying that's how we get into problems. Because you're asking me, how do we prevent this from happening? And I'm saying the way you prevent it is by people all being engaged. And it's not that we all know the same information, but what we should know is the terms and conditions of engagement. We should know how to ask questions, what kind of probing questions to ask. And you can only do that through experience. And if you're not prepared to be challenged, or to challenge people, or to study or come together, you'll never know what questions to ask, because you don't know how to engage in this issue. I think that's why that's contributory of why we make mistakes, because people are allowed to make mistakes, and they shouldn't be, because you've not got enough people who are asking sensible questions, I guess, if I can frame it that way. So an example is this. You have to, how do you approach this word? It's so easy to say, well, that looks really nice. And you can see it's not that straightforward, because Brother Tom's saying, by the way, it does mention the time of the end and an increase of knowledge. So it kind of alludes to that. But then you have to ask, was that the intent of what Ellen White's trying to talk about? And are we looking at Daniel 12 in the correct fashion? It's not that straightforward to do. But most of us aren't prepared to engage, because if I point to people, they say, don't ask me, I'm a newbie. I'll just listen. You did the very same thing when I asked you. No, I don't mean that to pick on you, but you did say, you said, no, I don't know. I'm saying, well, you're a leader in Israel, aren't you? How come you don't know? How come you don't know how to, not you don't know the answer, it's not that. It's how do you approach the things? That's why we get mistakes. It's a number of multifaceted things, and I don't know. I guess I'm going to say what Elder Jeff says. You know, we know all the numbers, but what are the rules? I'm giving you some rules of how to engage with these things, but the implementation of those rules, because there's not just one, takes practice. It's not that straightforward to do. If that makes sense. Brother Daniel.
Can you tell us how you approach this quote? Because I'm curious.
This quote?
Yes.
I don't know.
I believe we all
okay, so I approached the quote. with the following premise, that Ellen White is not going to give us 1989, like here it is. 1989 is just before you in 1903, and we could do some, some kind of, see what's happening in 1903, maybe do a time calculation. I don't think she's going to do that. So I'm approaching it that this time of the end is not Daniel 11 verse 40 part B. Without even reading all the context. Then I would go to the context and look through that to see what is the point that she's making. Why is she referencing, we went to Daniel 12:1 because it's in that paragraph, but she quotes some other paragraphs as well, particularly Luke 21. And not only Luke 21, she also goes to Matthew 25. She brings in the parable of the 10 virgins. And she talks about the lack of diligence or lack of preparation of God's people. So it seems to me that what she's talking about is this idea here, where she says the time of the end, it's talking about the end of probationary time, where everything's about to get wrapped up, and if we're not getting ready, what we're going to do is say, let's delay that event, let's delay the end of time, the end of probationary time. So that's how I would be approaching the subject. Obviously you have to go in, then you have to go into details about how you're even approaching Daniel 12. Do you go to the details of the time of the end and say, is that the truth we're drawing out? Or the theme? I'd go to Daniel 12 and say if you go to Revelation 13, what's Revelation 13 about? So I would say Revelation 13 is about the Sunday law. And how would we know that? Because when you start looking at the details of Revelation 13, it talks about a beast coming out of the sea, and it's between the sea and the earth, it's right there. So where is that date? What date is it bringing you to when it's come out of the sea and going onto the land, that transition point, if you like, on the beach? So most people are going to say 1798, but it tells you something about the beast. It says on its 10 horns it has 10 crowns. So as soon as I'm seeing the 10 crowns on that beast, I'm saying even though it's beginning in 1798, Revelation 13's got nothing to do with 1798. It's talking about a time period where 10 kings are ruling. And when do 10 kings rule? When do 10 kings rule? Yeah.
Before the Trump, after Trump.
Okay, I'm going to say the Sunday law. It's the Sunday law that the 10 kings are ruling. We can show this from another passage. So the fact that it's coming out of the sea is some preamble that helps you to understand how you're going to get to the Sunday law. So you can either approach chapters just through the detailed information of the verses, or you can approach it with a theme. And I think you need to do both, and more often than not we just look at the detail, the minutiae, and you can get lost in that noise. So when you come to Daniel 12, why would it start at the time of the end? Michael's going to stand up at that time. Because it's a flow-on from Daniel 11, so it would have to begin there, because it's the last point of verse 45. And then it's going to explain what's going on in that intervening history. So it's about the approach of how you go approaching the verses themselves. It's far too easy to... I've seen people do this lots of times. They take a word, then they go to the Hebrew word, then they go to in that Hebrew word, we did it earlier. If we look at the Greek word, we went down 3 levels, if you remember. It said parable, then it was another word, then the other word was from 2 words, which meant throw near. What people do is they take one of those words and they look at all the definitions of them, and they pick up an obscure meaning, like twist. And then they go back and say, oh, that word then in that verse means to bind. And I think that is not a correct approach. You open yourself up to making mistakes when you start doing that. When you start not approaching our study of inspiration in a reasonable fashion. So that's kind of how I approach it. I'm not saying I'm immune to mistakes. I don't think anyone is. But it's being accountable to one another and having our information, what we teach, in the public domain so people can challenge that. I think far too often we don't challenge people. And part of the reason is not because we're shy or we're embarrassed, it's because we don't know even how to challenge. We don't know what to ask or what not to ask, because we're kind of like observers, and we need to stop doing that. Run out of time. Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness and mercy. We want to ask and pray for a blessing. Lord, please be with us and guide us, direct us in the study and meditation of your word. Lord, there's an example that you've heard in our discussion about this passage from 15MR. Help us, Lord, to see the example that we just discussed as evidence of the work that you want to do with your people in developing our understanding and our hearts and our minds to a correct interpretation and understanding of your word. Please be with us and guide us, we pray in Jesus' name.